So, welcome back, Steven Erikson. I'm very happy to have you here on the Nostalgic Dragon BookTube channel. So, nice to have you here.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. We had a very interesting conversation last time, so I hope we can sort of build on that. That would be
Yeah,
cool.
and many of the viewers who watched conversation appreciated it. And unfortunately, I had by mistake a cliffhanger. So, people were very curious. Then you told me that you appreciated the talks on spirituality and Malazan. So,
Mhm.
that is where we are going to continue our conversation
Cool,
today.
cool.
And I'm going to frame the discussion a little bit first, very short.
Hmm.
That maybe for you who are watching as well, fantasy is maybe you read it just for entertainment purpose or other kind of purpose, but maybe entertainment, and maybe you feel connection to the characters or to the universe or to the world. But obviously, in many fantasy literature and many books, especially the Malazan book of the Fallen, maybe we're going to discuss that. There are many spiritual concepts. It could be gods and different spiritual practices or rituals or shamans, many different things. So my idea here is to start to discuss a little bit on what spirituality maybe is and how it can be portrayed in especially your works and your fantasy Malazan Book of the Fallen. If it's my interpretation or if you have an idea that some of the writing can have spiritual connections and why it happens.
Wow. Yeah, it's a pretty broad. I mean, I'm going to be struggling even to define spirituality, um, at least as I see it. I guess it's a kind of, um, I don't even know if this is a word, irrational, um, acknowledgement or recognition of something that our senses cannot necessarily perceive. And so it's kind of a belief system in uh, the unseen and the unknowable, but there's an element to which our behavior and practices can open a small window to that other realm, if you will, um, and then engage in a form of dialogue of some kind. Um, so the spiritual side of things is very much intrinsic to the world building of any culture, including our own. Um, and I think it's we have I mean our Western civilization is a bit of a an outlier when it comes to human civilizations. Where following the Enlightenment, I guess, we began to sort of culturally denigrate um, spirituality. Um, and as a consequence of that, a lot of understanding of that engagement with that other world, uh, it goes to the wayside. It ceases to be approached with the same analytical vigor that you would get in the rest of the sciences. Um, and I think that's been to our detriment. But what fantasy allows, epic fantasy, is, I mean, because you're creating a secondary world, at least in the Malazan sense, you can open those doors of exploration all over again. Um, and because it's very much once removed, um, you can sort of tackle issues that would be um, politically volatile to tackle here on this world. So that engagement of sort of the rational mind, which is very much a Western product, um, with something like spirituality, is kind of almost central to a lot of the world building that goes on in the Malazan world. Um, it's basically trying to sort of counter that very strict fact-based, observational, Newtonian, empirical, whatever you want to call it, universe, and the belief system that adheres to that versus a belief system that acknowledges that we don't have all the answers and that the universe is a lot more complicated than we ever thought.
Mm. That is interesting. Was that when you started to write? It's a long time ago, but was it just happening or was it intentional?
I
So
think,
I know you have your archaeological background as well. So
yeah, probably. I mean, the archaeology it's tangentially connected, but I would say because my degree was in anthropology, so a lot of my coursework was anthropological, cultural anthropology, ethnology, ethnography. Um, so through that, one gets exposed to um, other cultural practices. And if you can sort of disentangle the colonial aspect to that kind of thing, which is really actually quite difficult within anthropology. But if you can do so, then I don't know. For myself, I was left with a greater appreciation for um, the myriad variations of belief systems that were out there and the practices that were engaged in. And then as an archaeologist, when you end up quite often, at least we did, working alongside indigenous populations. Um, and their engagement with the environment was fundamentally sort of different um, than the scientific, pseudoscientific archaeological approach. Um, and I found that to be really intriguing as well and equally valid. Um, so I guess all of those experiences were all kind of feeding into both myself and Cam because we're both archaeologists and we both worked in similar environments on the same projects in some cases. So it was always part of our discourse, even when we were gaming this stuff. It was to really sort of open up, to acknowledge that there are different ways of seeing and interpreting the universe around us. And it would be strange to create a secondary world, a fantasy world, um, that's founded upon this sort of Western notion of rationality. It didn't make sense. So
one thing that comes to my mind actually is I read a lot of on Malazan Reddit or Facebook. People ask the timelines, and I read your answer about timeline. And since I'm a yoga practitioner, meditation practitioner, you forget about time. You could say
yeah,
there is no time. This is just a man-made concept of what has been before and now and after. So when I don't know if you've commented in publicly, but they were referred to the people trying to really nail the timeline and they couldn't get it right, you could say.
yeah.
Mm,
But again, that's a product of our Western civilization.
mm,
There was that historical drive to categorize and to make lists,
mm,
and to basically subdivide the observable universe and the unobservable, microscopic, if you will, um, into discrete packages that could be explored and explained.
mm,
Um, so it's not surprising that we've all gone through that education, at least in the West,
mm,
um, and it's the one that really wants these things to be in an orderly fashion,
mm,
um, a mechanistic fashion, if you will. And you don't have to go very far back in human history, in the history of civilization, to leave all that stuff behind. Um, that's a fairly recent phenomenon. Um, a lot of the only real evidence of list making and categorization was related to economics. The early writings were all about surplus and how many bushels of wheat and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all accounting.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very much an important part of the emergence of writing. Um, so other aspects of the writing it also involve things like military conquest and um, again listing of deeds of great kings and war leaders and all the rest. So those early forms of communication as writing were already quite structured, quite rigid in the way they partitioned and categorized the environments around them. I guess it was part of the necessity to organize because your populations were growing. Sedentarianism and agriculture just expanded those populations and created hierarchies and created differentiated status and surplus and then warfare and then slavery and it's just so all of this stuff needs to be organized in some fashion or another, otherwise it collapses. And monumental, architecture and building of irrigation systems and all the rest, all of that requires a certain level of organization. And so the list makers and the accountants were pretty important right from the beginning.
Yeah, true. And I think stories, I mean, from ancient times were transmitted, orally or verbally as well, like on verse or in poetry, shlokas in Indian ancient texts, for example, so people can remember them, not writing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even though you got all these mnemonic devices for remembering before writing arrives, it's also encoded in many ways, and it's also, I think, far more metaphorical in its intention than modern literalists would think in terms of looking back at that stuff. So there's a sophistication there that I think the modern interpretation has set to the wayside and doesn't acknowledge. I can't remember who the guy, what was his name? He wrote a number of books and did some documentaries. One was called in the Footsteps of Alexander. I can't remember the guy's name right now. Big fan of his stuff. He did In Search of Troy as well, which was an excellent book. Um, but when he was in traveling through, I guess, Afghanistan, he encountered a number of fairly remote peoples living in the highlands for whom the oral tradition has remained alive. And what he found so extraordinary was that somebody could tell a story that would last 3 or 4 days. And so it was a reminder that um, our sense of our memory is actually quite atrophied because of the written word. And there was a time when our memories were far, far better than they are now. So once you're thinking, in that context, then the notion of timelines and the past, it kind of morphs, it kind of changes. What is being remembered in the now is relevant to the now. It's not necessarily relevant to the past. And so as the memory is resurrected, it undergoes an alteration to make it relevant to the audience in front of the person telling the story. And so it's in constant flux and it evolves. And the factual truth basically disappears generation by generation. So yeah, we were definitely acknowledging that this whole notion of a fixated history, a recorded history, was in itself suspect. And even the idea of timelines. I don't know if you've read Cam's books, his Origins of Empire stuff, Origins of the Malazan Empire.
I've started to read, but Night of Knives and
Hmm.
also Dance's Lament.
Yeah, yeah, those ones.
Mm,
If you follow the one from Dancer's Lament, that series, I mean, there's a joke delivered that it took Cam like three books to get to, related to um, the the year given as the birth of the Malazan Empire,
mm,
and the fact that it's basically entirely made up.
mm,
Um, and so once that happens, once you've got, that initial premise is undermined,
mm,
then timelines are completely irrelevant.
mm. I think that's interesting, because it challenges, as you said, the notions how you maybe describe reality or write stories in not only the West, but I suppose in the world. Just to remind myself, you had a good explanation about spirituality, and I have another. It doesn't
Mhm.
is not in conflict with what you say, but that's more from a yoga practitioner point of view. And I wrote down some keywords here. Non-materialistic, I think you said. Irrational or irrational was a better way of putting it, I think. Searching for deeper meaning, if you look at individual level, that is far from, desire things and things that make your mind quiet.
Mhm.
You're searching for that through different ways of living. Um,
Yeah.
Something greater than yourself, something greater than
Yeah. Yeah.
individual.
I guess uh, the premise is you achieve that internal quietude in order to open yourself out beyond your conscious state as
Mhm.
it's self-contained within our bodies, um, which then I guess yeah is reaching for a sense of unity with everything that exists beyond us.
Mm, mm,
Um, but I was going to say something regarding that notion of interior silence. I would think that a lot of the drive for um, the spiritual quest, if you will,
mm,
um, is is born of the question why, like why are we here? And I think that's one of those aspects that will probably haunt the human mind forever because we're all about cause and effect and answering that question of why. If you do this, why does that happen?
mm,
If you don't do this, why does that happen? And ultimately, yeah, it goes down to those deeper questions of why is existence? Why do things exist? And why do we exist? And what's our purpose? And all the rest. And for many people, the conventional answers of you exist to serve the state is not quite palatable. It's not enough.
mm, mm,
So there are things that um, basically reject that kind of material foundations um, as explanations for why we exist. And I guess in many respects, this is where that first drive for spirituality comes from, and it's pre-hominid. It's pre-human for sure.
mm,
Um, there does seem to be evidence that Homo naledi was practicing this. Certainly, Neanderthals were, probably Denisovans. So it goes way back. So it's not necessarily bound to any particular rise of civilization or technological advancement or anything along those lines. Um, Although we tend to sort of think of it in those terms. We tend to sort of create this hierarchy for. I don't know if you've ever played Civilization,
yeah,
Sid
yeah,
Meier.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, look at the
Mm,
built-in bias of
mm,
that, right? It goes
mm,
from, I don't know what it is, some kind of, well, it goes from polytheism to monotheism as
mm,
an evolutionary
mm,
rise, right? I mean, that's absurd. There's no reason to think in
mm,
those terms.
mm.
Um, but if you're going to win the game, you basically have to end up monotheistic. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty strange, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think your books, your writing, um, turns that, on its head,
Mhm.
because not many, but some of the characters in Malazan are very convinced how things are, but then as things are revealed later in the books, it's maybe upside down, or it has been things maybe 100,000 years back that people didn't know about, because
Mhm.
some of the characters, especially in Guardians of the Moon, my impression, are a bit confused on at least why they are there, what they are doing, and they are thrown into different
Mhm.
contexts and situations, and then it's like kind of what's a backtracking. Usually,
Mhm.
when maybe you read a book, you are not backtracking. Here's the beginning and here's the end. I know you start maybe in the middle of Malazan and then go back, and then you go forward and back again and
Mhm.
jump back and forth, like we humans do, I think, when we
Yeah.
ask for why as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, there's a built-in need in all of us to at least feel somewhat secure in where our place is,
Mm.
in a society, in a culture, in time. And I think that's probably fairly universal for the human condition. And so that's always going to be a quest or a desire for characters in order to achieve some sense of security and stability in their lives. Um, and of course, for characters like soldiers, then the entire apparatus of the military is all about stability and security,
Mm.
um, in order to allow, the chaos of battle to actually take place, usually in a fairly ritualized fashion. Um, so yeah, that that push and pull is always going to be there, and that's part of what motivates and what drives characters, whether they're conscious of it or not.
Yeah, great. So timeline and motivation and why and search for meaning. We've touched on a lot of, you could say, spiritual stuff. I would add in spirits in this, but we will talk about it that soon. But we can broaden it a bit as well, because spiritual, I mean, now it's a mainstream term and it can mean a lot
Mhm.
of different things for many people.
Yeah.
If you read the old yoga scriptures, it's a very firm definition of what yoga is or what spirituality is. It's much broader today. But one thing that you mentioned just a few minutes ago is I think you said the Native Americans, the relationship to environment, or ancient, you could say, tribes. And
Hmm.
nature is a recurring theme in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I told you before we recorded, but to the viewers as well who has just started to read the Malazan books, you don't need to be worried, because the holy desert Raraku is mentioned in Gardens of the Moon. So if you haven't got to those pages yet, you will come to them. The desert is holy and it holds a lot of power. And um, I was thinking about your way of dealing with nature and spirits and spirituality, and yeah, if it's my interpretation or if it's something there, of course, and how you relate to that, since you have your archaeological background as well. You have been outside in the nature making
Hmm.
digs and found things that I suppose can feel, very ritual customs or
Hmm.
things like that when you find I say skeletons now, but you maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it started even before archaeology because I was a counselor with the YMCA, and so we did canoe trips uh, into sort of fairly remote areas. So I always had, and because my parents took us basically fishing every weekend, um, so we were always out somewhere on the weekends. So that love of nature, I think, started very early on for me. But within the notion of writing fiction, I think early on, with discussions on things like setting, um, it became of interest to me at least to think of the setting, i.e., whatever is around the story, as being, if not a character, at least integral to the characterization. and that your characters and their state of mind can actually alter the perception of the environment around them. And then to use the environment to reflect the state of mind of characters. So, for an example, think of a hill with a tree, and you've got a character who's looking at it. If that hill is covered in grasses and blossoms, and the tree is in full bloom, you're actually kind of reflecting the state of mind of that character, or you can potentially. If you turn it around and it's a denuded hill with a skeletal tree with nothing but dead branches on it, then you've created a different kind of reflection on what that character, their state of being. And it's not a one-to-one thing, and it's not something you would do all the time, but it's where the various aspects of narrative structure, of narrative, can interconnect and support each other in fairly subtle ways. But in terms of thinking of the relationship between a human being, or I guess any sentient being, and nature itself, is also one of the things that was explored a lot in the Malazan world. Primarily because one of the inspirations, of course, was the two-tiered religious systems in ancient Greece, where you had the pantheon with all the various gods, but then you had a kind of a chthonic, earth-based kind of existence, where you had dryads and nereids and spirits related to households and thresholds and springs and various other things. So that was kind of almost the witch or shaman-based level. Even as the civilization was rising around it, the people in the countryside were practicing a religion that was probably a bit more private and more immediate for them, rather than the pantheon. And so you've got that kind of different approaches to engagement with the environment. Things like Zeus and Hera and Athena and all the rest, they are very much a humanized kind of entity. So they may have powers, but they also display the characteristics of human nature. Whereas raw nature doesn't necessarily do so. And so the relationship between someone and these gods is a different relationship. That's a human relationship, regardless of whether the god's immortal or not. But the relationship then between a human and the immediate environment around them, that's a dialogue with something that is not human. And so it requires, I think, a bit more care in the approach of how you're going to engage with this stuff. And it's interesting because a lot of knowledge was derived from that chthonic stuff, because it related to the use of plants and herbs and various other things that needed to be experimented on before they became palatable for human use. And I've always been fascinated with that level of experimentation. You think of something like ayahuasca. I mean, its component elements to that potion are lethal. So somebody had to experiment to actually get, the right proportions and the proper treatments and processing and all the rest. It seems pretty risky thing to do. Something was driving people to do so. So that stuff's always sitting sort of within reach, if you will, of the common people, if you will, within the Malazan world especially. And so when you're looking at a place like Rariku, the Holy Desert, then it's a harsh component to the dialogue, um,
Mm.
and it is quite indifferent to human desires and human needs.
Mm.
Um, so even the nature of appeasement is different.
I mean,
Yeah.
the whirlwind
Mhm.
ha has its own life. I read when I read the reread of Dead House Gates, I was feel we think the spring is coming here, but obviously not. So it was a month ago I finished Dead House Gates for the
Mhm.
second time. When I read the last, I think 200 pages, it was a storm outside. So it was kind of atmospheric or
Yeah.
immersive, even though it was snow, it wasn't a desert. Maybe that was better. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah,
But,
much better.
but you could hear the sound. So when I was reading, I heard the sound. And when you read about the holy desert, Raraku, you have, I think you have the sound, you know,
Mhm.
in your head when you try to visualize that, and that seems greater than not only humans but the characters in the desert.
Yeah, I mean the landscape and the environment has a voice, and we build cities, and that basically drowns out that voice, and then we apply machines when we're clearing fields and planting fields, and that drives out the voice as well. But so yeah, getting right out there into the wilderness, regardless of the nature of that environment, it does have a voice. Um, you just have to listen carefully.
Was it random that it was a desert, or could Raraku has been something else? I know there are other nature powers in the Malazan world, but now Raraku is
Well,
a desert. So
no, I don't think it was random. There was evidence fairly early on, like in my schooling, that uh, analysis of climate change as it related to North Africa, for example, the Sahara. That evidence was coming to light that this had once been primarily a savanna and quite wet, relatively speaking, and therefore populated by lots of people and lots of animals and lakes and rivers and all the rest. Um, so I think that idea of a place like Rariku um, having almost a water-based history, but now being nothing but sand, certainly seemed to we have sort of we have examples of that in our world. But no, I think symbolically, one wanted the heat and the desiccation and the wind as representative of, I guess, a kind of chaos, kind of natural chaos. And of course, I'm not going to give too much in the way of spoilers, but
mm,
just in a general sense, the whirlwind was also uh, a symbolic manifestation of a very human condition.
mm.
I can't go any further than that, but
Yeah, I know. Um, when I was traveling in India,
Mhm.
I don't want to talk too much about it here because it's another topic, but I think some of you viewers know that I was adopted from India, and then I decided to go back to India to learn traditions and customs and so on. So I also learned a lot about Hinduism, which is
Mhm.
main interest for me. And people learning me that said that there are different schools and different traditions, but some people said that Hinduism is just nature. And if you read a lot about polytheistic faiths, and even I think monotheistic creation myths, it revolves around nature, and the first gods are usually nature gods, like the whirlwind
Mhm.
goddess, for example. So there are um, connections between the spiritual and the nature world.
Yeah, and I mean, the external environment is the first thing we engage in that we have no control over or very little control over. And the rise of cultures and civilizations is almost epitomized by uh, increasing efforts to establish control over the environment.
Mm, mm,
So, industrialization, all the rest. And so you go back far enough, and um, you have all these forces that you really don't, in many respects, you can kind of predict, but not always successfully. Um, but they are out of your control. Um, and to me, certainly what I've seen, in terms of studying uh, within sort of ethnology, cultural anthropology, is that imparts a kind of wisdom, kind of a collective wisdom in the population in question. The recognition that there are things that cannot be controlled, and then learning to live with that. Um, I think in the West, at some point we separated ourselves from nature and then fought this war and against nature, and so it's created a kind of adversarial approach towards it, um, where we actually resist, those forces of nature.
mm,
But if you've got gods and spirits that are actually more than capable of actually resisting those efforts to control it or the environment, then you've got a different dynamic going on completely. And that was certainly the case for the Malazan stuff.
mm. I think that is something I feel when I read Malazan, that because it's such a long time span of time, so 100,000 years and even more. You see all those, not only it's political as well, but you see the empires come and go, but you also see people fight against, you could say, nature, and you can see this circle that is.
Yeah.
We're in this circle running around, but it's something else governing the world than maybe the
Yeah.
characters in the book.
Yeah. Nature wins in the end. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's a spoiler for everyone, but
Yeah,
yeah, nature always wins.
yeah.
And
Sorry.
the remnants of, civilizations that where I've certainly have walked, um, uh, underscores that recognition all the time. Um, the 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 ambitions of a civilization can be vast, but all you need is 20 years of drought, and it's all done.
Mhm. Mm. Another thing, we change subject a little bit now
Mhm.
from the nature and spirituality. Since it's more or less spoiler free, more than less, we cannot go into details. But actually, my viewers has asked me later to be more spoilerish, you could say,
Okay.
because the discussions might get more interesting if we, maybe talk about more um, details in the books and characters, if it's possible, of course. But one thing I'm interested in is the deck of dragons
Hmm.
and spirituality, because I suppose for many of us who read your books, the tarot or tarot cards comes to mind, and also the alignment and the position of the different titles in the deck and how people get affected by it. So I'm curious about that also from a because a spiritual point of view, but also your inspiration for the deck of dragons, because it gives the Malazan books, I think, a special atmosphere that not so many fantasy literature has today,
Hmm.
I think.
Well, first of all, the Deck of Dragons was first created within the gaming context, and it was created by Cam, not me. So he would be the person to really ask about that. But if I were to just sort of think about it, we were both huge fans of um, Roger Zelazny's Amber novels, um, and there are aspects of that would also push you towards the origins of a deck of playing cards, and what are what's underlying these four suits and the
Mm.
symbology that's being used and the hierarchy and all the rest. And yeah, it does go back to um, employing some system of cards for the purposes of divination. And so the cards then become a bit more easily handled than sheep entrails or bones or whatever. So there is kind of that linkage. But of course, it's all founded on the premise that one actually can divine uh, future events on the basis of some kind of built-in, almost deterministic structure
Mm.
to the universe. So one of the things that we ended up doing with the deck of dragons, once it got past the games, um, was as a kind of meta commentary within the novels, because quite often you would get a reading which would actually um, prefigure the plot that you were going to fall into. And if you could interpret those readings, you would see that, yeah, the rest of the story is told by that reading. So that was just a bit of fun that Cam and I were having with messing around with plot and giving a lot away without appearing to do so.
Mhm. That's very interesting to hear and very fascinating. But for like Ganos Paran is, I mean, he's yeah, maybe a little spoily, but not too much.
Yeah, spoilers.
Yeah, it was. Sorry, but
Oh, that's okay. But yeah, it's one of the things that was interesting, and we did it in the gaming, in fact, was we recognized quickly that even with tarot, I mean, there's a multitude of variations of tarot. Right? You can get different decks for all
mm,
kinds of things. Um, and we like the idea of fluidity in the deck of dragons, so that um, no two decks were necessarily alike. They shared characteristics, um, but you could have variations
mm,
on the decks, and that sort of opened things up for, I guess, culture-specific variations. So the Baruch deck from Darujhistan is
mm,
different from what, say, Fiddler would have used or Tattersail.
mm,
Um, and in terms of what that actually says about the efficacy of divination, um, well, it is a fantasy world, so we kind of felt free to do whatever we wanted to there.
mm, mm. But and that was my, I think, my question. Um, when you when you laid the or when you worked with those decks or deck of dragons, when you wrote the 10 books, or Cam as well with the other books as well, the characters who get affected by the deck of dragons, without mentioning them too much, then was that something that came progressively, or when you were writing, or had you ideas how certain characters should develop within the deck of dragons?
It's probably a bit of both. It went back and forth. If you think of the various roles within the deck, we always had certain cards, if you will, were um, fairly well fixed with the persona that was behind it, whether it was a god or an ascendant of any kind. But there was a lot of unoccupied cards, if you will. So that always gave us room to take characters within the story, and they could at least temporarily stand in that place within the deck and serve that function, serve that purpose. Um, and that kept things malleable, kept it flexible, so that even though you may have had one character who played a particular role, say in I don't know, House of Shadow, Magi, or Assassin, or whatever,
Mm,
within one novel, that could change with the next novel
mm,
because it was a role that was stepped into briefly for those circumstances, and so that kept things fairly fluid, and it also it 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 didn't date the deck of dragons, right? Because if you had fixed it completely,
Mm,
Uh, then as events changed in the pantheon, the deck of dragons then would become increasingly more obsolescent.
mm. Is there a real world equivalent to the deck of dragons? I know, I mean, from other
Um,
mythology or anything like that.
no, not that I know of. Apart from, its uh, subspecies of the playing cards, your basic
Mm,
playing cards.
mm,
Um, so that's probably the only thing. Although, I mean, I don't know, you had tiles.
mm,
You got I Ching. So you've got, all kinds of similar practices, I guess.
mm,
Um, Systemic approaches to divination.
mm,
Um, but I know I've heard people have tried to employ their version of the deck of dragons for tarot style divination.
mm, mm,
I wouldn't recommend it,
mm.
but people will do whatever they do, I guess.
Yeah, sounds dramatic. It can be dramatic enough with tarot.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, that's very interesting. Deck of Dragons. We talked a little bit about Carnivale before the
Hmm.
recording. Maybe we won't talk so much about that, but for you viewers who have not watched the series, it's very good, and it has a lot to do with tarot. And when I read Steven's books initially, I got positive vibes when I read about the Deck of Dragons and thought about the Carnival. So it was some kind of also a kind of divination.
It was, yeah. It's one of those cases of I find this so common now. The series I love the most are the ones that end up getting cut, and Carnival was brilliant,
Mm.
but to only last for 2 seasons, that
Yeah,
sucked.
that was a shame, I think, but that's what happens with good series,
I know, it's
unfortunately.
frustrating.
Um, as you know, I have the idea of recording for also for the viewers for maybe an hour. We have some minutes left. There are some
Hmm?
things I would like to briefly touch upon, and it's more about what people are doing in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So, people meditate, they drink tea. There are
Hmm?
shamans and there are rituals. Maybe that's more advanced, but especially the that you actually have meditation in your book. Says it's appealing for me and probably other readers as well. But what was your take on that? With meditation, and it must have come from somewhere, or was it just something
Um,
good for the characters to do?
I guess initially, before I started sort of exploring stuff on a personal level, it was definitely the anthropological um, interpretation of ritual behavior, but also psychological interpretation. My father went back to school to become a psychologist. And so when he was in university, I was just entering high school. And so the house was full of textbooks, psychology textbooks. And I was pretty much insatiable as a reader. So I read them all.
Hmm.
So I basically read all of his textbooks through all the way until eventually he got his PhD. Um, so there's a psychological component that I can sort of apply to the anthropology as well. But it's fairly well established that repetitive practice, as well as acoustics, um, can can lead a person into a trance state, and that is an altered state without any question. It's also a state in which time does strange things. So I'd been invited to. I mean, I've done a sweat lodge. I was invited to a Sundance, but I couldn't make it,
Hmm.
unfortunately. But
Hmm.
um, so that aspect of um, humans engaging in an activity that alters their perception of the environment around them and their relationship to it. Um, And anthropologically, I mean, that has always, almost in every culture, involved psychoactive substances of some form or another.
Mm.
So that is just a common trait of the human condition. And so it certainly made sense that in the Malazan world, you would have every example imaginable, even ones that we just invented on the fly,
Mhm.
because humans are very inventive when it comes to finding ways to uh, alter their perceptions.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. So we have touched upon many spiritual concepts here, and there are plenty of things to talk about, but time is running out a bit because I'm a bit careful. I'm caring for you viewers as well, because some videos can be very long on YouTube. This is still a long video on YouTube, so I think that's good for now. But one thing I would like to mention before we finish is that I'm rereading your Midnight Tides, and maybe this is kind of antithesis to what we've been talking about today without spoiling too much. I was showing you an article before we recorded about archaeology like this. It's about
Mm-hmm.
skeleton heads in Sweden that I found from the Viking Age. But if you look at the other side, this is in Swedish, so it's probably not understandable for you, but this is about, our flexible rate for, buying houses. And then I thought about midnight tide somehow. So it was a funny
It's a nice
set. Um, because some of your books concern not only, or I mean, not only, but spirituality and things like philosophy. And it's also about um, maybe not capitalism, but monetary society.
Yeah, monetary for
Mm,
sure. Systems of control,
mm,
economic systems, and how that ties into social stratification
mm,
and maintaining a particular status quo.
mm,
And who decides on the status quo? Well, the people in power, and they maintain it in order to stay in power and to
mm,
stay wealthy. And that's a pretty much a universal. Um, although David Graeber in I can't remember the archaeologist, but in his book where he's discussing the rise of cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, so Sumerian, pre-Sumerian, there seems to be a lot of evidence that uh, it was a very egalitarian beginning, which is kind of contrary to what one would expect with the rise of cities. Um, so it may be that whatever external forces forced the changes on the Sumerian Proto-Sumerian civilization is what brought about that structured hierarchy that we see now.
mm,
Um, but yeah, it is interesting that what we take almost as a natural law of civilization may not be.
mm. Yeah, that's wise. I think for you viewers who haven't read the whole series, I think you become wise of reading your books, and that also Ian sees it's a lot of wisdom in the books. So I think that's one thing that is makes them interesting to reread as well. So with that, Stephen, I would like to thank you. If you have something to add, of course, you can do that. But otherwise, thank you very much for being here
Oh,
again.
no, it's been fascinating. Yeah, interesting questions. I tend not to think in specifically uh, in terms of the spiritual aspects of the story. I mean, one writes to create. If you're creating a world, you have to have variety in there, verisimilitude and variety. So yeah, the more that one can sort of populate the world with diversity, the better, for sure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good. Thank you. And yeah, see you soon.
Yep. Take care.